You are listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with a global soul. Our theme music is a clip of Summer Nights by the Eric Jones Trio. It's provided by our friend Mark Chesanout, who plays with the Eric Jones Trio every Thursday and Sunday at Good Times Jazz Bar downtown.
Hey everyone, welcome to Arts on the Air. This is Tamara Garvey, and I'm sitting down with printmaker Curtis Bartone. Welcome, Curtis. So glad to have you. I'm going to read a little bit from your website of your statement. My paintings, drawings, and etchings focus on the uneasy relationship between human beings and the natural world, exploring the idea of wilderness and how it has changed from being a real place, mysterious, unknown, and pristine, to a distorted fiction. Can you describe what do you mean by a distorted fiction? I was curious about that.
It's interesting that, you know, our perception of the natural world comes a lot from television. You know, what we search on our computer, like if you search for giraffes, you'd get this idea that these really big, pristine places exist with giraffes. And like our perception of that is not direct. So there's a mediated experience.
Yeah,
there.
Like everything through screens.
Mm-hmm. And even going back to, you know, I like to look back at like natural science illustrations and stuff like that. That was also a intermediary between our experience and...
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, you're looking at whatever the artist, whatever they happen to be filtering through.
Right.
Wasn't that kind of an idea when they started doing scientific illustrations for medical textbooks, that they specifically, like, in some areas they want it to be by an artist and not a photograph, because it's easier for the students to like learn by the diagrams if some of the information is taken away and it's only the things they really need to see.
Right, and I look at those 18th century illustrations of anatomy illustrations by Albinus that were like these flayed figures that were in these Roman landscapes. So they're beautiful engravings, like really wonderful.
It's like a ghoulish half body in a landscape.
But I even go back to like top cells animals where they're a mix of observed natural world mixed with these mythological things. So it's part legend, part... Yeah. And it's written authoritatively, like this is...
Oh, it's stated to be so.
Yeah. You know, like satyrs and, you know...
What era is that from?
That would be... I'm really bad with dates. I think that would be like 17th century.
Okay.
Or 18th. But it's Top Cell's History of Beasts, it's called.
History of Beasts,
like
I love
these terrible wood engravings, too.
Okay, I have to look that up.
Yeah, it's really exciting.
That really, the way you describe it, that just your art just makes so much sense, because I had a note to ask you about this later. But yeah, a lot of times it looks like, it's like realistic animals in these sort of like Garden of Good and Evil type wild hellscapes, almost. How did you originally get into this this concept that you were looking at? Is this how your art is always focused?
No. It's sort of it's a weird evolution, and then you start to develop your own iconography. So you know, so it becomes so convoluted after a while that it's hard. Like I always dread, like I always tell my students, you need kind of an elevator pitch about your work, and then I'm like, well, I don't really have
a little, like a little tiny.
But anyway, so I started. I'm really interested in Dutch 17th century still lifes and that whole symbolism of, you know, these wealthy people would commission a painter to show this is how wealthy I am. This is all the things I can take from all over the world.
There would be all these really symbolic
that decadent.
things.
But then there's also the sort of religious undercurrent. That's like you're still going to die, and you know, I got into that, and I started doing work about food. So I'd make these really decadent paintings about. Really, I would pirate them from, you know, fancy cookbooks and stuff, and I would just imagine these spreads of ridiculous
like these
food that didn't go together. And I would take things from like Jell-O cookbook, where, you know, there's these things that are really made out of plaster that are being photographed, and I would put those in. Then I started combining them with, and these were all mainly still life based. I started.
Is this when you were an undergrad?
This was after grad school.
Okay.
The like my school experience, I was working with very busy compositions, and that's how I'm moving away from that a little bit.
Yeah.
But a lot of pattern-based things, and that sort of informed my aesthetic. But when I got out of grad school, I started, my work changed.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I was food-based and still life-based, and then I realized I was taking my classes to draw. I was living in Chicago. That's where I pretty much established my art career.
Your early adulthood.
And it's still what formed me. Like I those artists I know better than artists that are based in New York.
Okay.
But anyway, I would go to the Field Museum with my drawing classes and the Field Museum of Natural History, and we draw all the animals and stuff. And I'm drawing with them, and I'm like, these are also things that are collected and presented, just like a spread of food in a magazine.
And they might have religious.
So I started putting those
overtones.
in, where there was a question, what were they doing here? Are they dead or alive? And something really interesting happened. And then I started, other consumable things entered the work. I started listening how wealthy people collect vacations, so they have like a postcard and they're like, I went there, and they check it off. And I started to put postcard backgrounds in these things. So I wanted that sort of, all these things that could be collected or experienced.
Were you doing like an animal that wouldn't naturally be in that environment? So they were like an ironic.
Yeah, and also that it happens a lot. I get ideas a lot from things I read. I read a Saul Bellow book called Ravelstein, and there's a scene in that book where the only time this guy notices nature is living in Chicago is he sees a flock of parrots that has escaped, parakeets. Okay. And he's wondering how in the world they live.
Because it just looks
winter.
so
and so a lot of my work is like that almost. It's like kind of this, these things that get taken where they don't belong, and they end up there.
Like there's these moments through history where an animal was accidentally taken to isn't that how like wild boars were introduced to Hawaii and they shouldn't be there, and they're tearing it up.
That are eating all the birds and
right. And then they end up destroing the natural ecosystem.
Right. But even things we import, for our gardens, and they go like kudzu.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Was that so in Chicago? Do you feel like were you sort of, did it hit you because you're sort of like starved for seeing natural beauty and
and I grew up on a farm actually, but I was raised in the city, and then my parents got divorced. I moved to a farm, and I got really into birds, and I still am.
Yeah.
And so I spent a lot of time roaming and just watching wildlife and watching birds, and I thought I would go into that. I was so driven to art.
Oh, that you might.
But I thought I might go into
like ornithology
or something. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. And I guess in birds specifically, when you're talking about animals that are in a place that they shouldn't be, birds are like, they would have the easiest time doing that, right?
Right.
They can get themselves somewhere else.
Right. And they often do. Some of them don't. There's a book called World on the Wings. It's about how amazing birds are, but they often get their homing device is wrong, and they end up in the wrong place, and that can be a beneficial thing, because if they end up adapting to climate change or something, it's a good thing. But they will end up in. That's why we'll see some weird South American bird that would never be native here.
Is it just one random bird that gets off, or would it be a whole flock?
No, it's usually just one that ends up somewhere where it's not supposed to. Yeah. So
that reminds me. I have a drawing that I did where I came across. I also was just reading randomly, and I came across this one bird called the Arctic tern, and it has the biggest migration of any bird, because it goes back and forth between the Arctic and Antarctica. So there's no possible further place for it to go, and it's this tiny little cute bird that migrates the entire globe. It's kind of incredible.
They're tiny cute birds. I was in Iceland, and they're tiny cute birds that are really territorial and will actually dive bomb you.
Oh, wow. Did you
have
that experience?
Yes. And we wondered why people were wearing bicycle helmets where we were.
Wow.
Yeah, so we ended up being driven out of their territory pretty fast.
That's so funny you brought that up. I did make a note to ask you later about Iceland, because that sounded pretty incredible. So we'll back up a little bit. Were you, when you went to grad school, were you already focused on printmaking? Did you have to get?
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm sort of a latecomer to printmaking.
Okay.
I took lithography in undergraduate school, but I was a painter, painters are really, they can be egotistical. Like, I'm a painter, and I had that attitude. And
it's like a macho kind of thing.
Yeah, I went to Columbus College of Art and Design in Columbus, Ohio, and it was just a fine arts major, and you specialized in something. So I specialized in painting, so I took printmaking and ceramics. I took lithography, and I liked it, but I didn't love it.
Yeah.
And I learned it, and there was a guy named James Weigel, who was Tamarind trained. That's all lithographers that are really good lithographers are trained at Tamarind Institute in New Mexico.
Oh.
And we called him the litho-Nazi, because he would knock our grade down if we had ink on the backs of our prints.
Oh, he was a real purist.
And he would make us proof up with really stiff ink, so it would take us like 100 prints to get it to be dark enough, just like to you know.
Is
So we
that
taught traditional stone lithography.
Okay. Is that, so when you talk about stiff ink and then it takes you a lot of passes to get it, is that a really traditional way?
It's a way
to do
make
like
it
more
so that
pure?
when you first print a stone and it doesn't want to behave, you creep up on it so that it starts to
You're not
stabilize
going to mess it up.
Right.
That's a lot like watercolor, where you have to go
Yes.
slowly and do little washes because you can push it too far.
Right.
So I would think, so I'm really excited to talk to you just about printmaking in general, because I just feel like it's so mysterious, and if people haven't taken specific art classes, they have no idea about printmaking. But I would imagine, like, when you were going to school also, that it would have been even more like odd and quirky and so niche, and like, you know, to major in art is already, you're kind of taking a risk. But if you major in painting, then people can understand that, they can wrap their head around it.
Right.
Yeah.
So I didn't do printmaking, and then I went to grad school, and there was a guy named Philip Chen who is now at Drake in Iowa, but I went to Northwestern, which is what brought me to Chicago, and he taught me etching, and it completely, like, I love Albrechter, so I'm like, this is what he did, and this is what Rembrandt
Those
did.
splayed out bodies.
And you know, the thing about printmaking that's really interesting is you immediately, even if you're doing something contemporary, there's always that edge that taps into that whole.
Yes.
Like, there's a look.
The look of it looks very ancient. Even
if you can't draw like Rembrandt, you're doing something that looks like.
Yes, it has this look of like a botanical illustration, a book that has the word figure on it, and it's lightly watercolored. Right. It just has that era to it.
And then I was hooked, and I just, you know, I got my degree in painting. But my thesis show was mostly drawings and etchings, and a few paintings, which they did not like. But
but you would
everything I do, everything I do is drawing. I love drawing, so everything is drawing based. And real printmakers that like majored in printmaking, you know, if I say, for me, it's just a totally different way to make a drawing. That's what attracted me to it.
Yeah.
It interferes. And so you kind of have to accept its interference, which I really like.
There's some chaos in it.
Yeah, and you have to go, oh, I put that in the acid too long. What am I going to do?
Right.
So you scrape into it, and you end up with something way better than what you
Yeah, it's a lot. It seems it's sort of like when I've talked to ceramicists that it's a little science and it's a little art, and depending on how kind of anal you are about it, you're either keeping notes and trying to replicate things, or things spin off, and like it could be the temperature, it could be the consistency of things. There's a lot to it, like baking.
And so I. You know, the hardest thing for a printmaker, so I got really hooked on printmaking, and then I graduated, and there's no place to print. Luckily, I was in Chicago, so so I was teaching at a whole bunch of places, and I was at the Evanston Art Center in Evanston, north of Chicago, and they had a print shop, so I would teach a couple classes, and we got to take a class for free. So I was there, and I worked with Audrey Niffenegger, who was one of my fellow grad students. And we had our thesis show together, in fact. And she was a really good etcher, and so I worked with her a lot. And so the nice thing about that is, because I had a weird printmaking education, I learned how to like mix all my own stuff and how to work with really shoddy equipment and how to fix it. And that was a really good.
Yeah, I think it's good training.
Yeah, but I only did etching. That was all I was interested in.
Can you describe for people a little bit? Can you encapsulate lithography and etching?
Oh yeah, okay. So the process is, the easiest one is relief, right? So you carve, whatever's carved away doesn't print, you roll ink over the top surface prints. Intaglio,
picture like a rubber stamp.
Right. So intaglio is like the opposite. There's other differences, but the principle is the opposite. So you're inking it, you're wiping the ink off, and it stays in the low areas. So relief is the high areas print. Intaglio is the low areas print, so you're wiping the ink off that surface, and it's staying in all the lines and texture, whatever texture you put on the plate. Now, how you get the texture on the plate, there's a whole chemistry thing involved, like you know, using acids to make lines or drawing them physically into the plate. Lithography is nothing like the other two. So lithography, which is what I'm mostly teaching and making now, is this magic process where, if you do it traditionally, it's done on these Bavarian limestones that come from exactly where a guy named Alois Sennefelder invented lithography in 1796 in Solnhofen, Germany. All of our limestones come from there. But anyway, you draw with special greasy materials, crayons, washes that have grease, and
almost like this wax.
Yeah, and wax pencils too. But the wax will print, but the grease actually bonds with the calcium carbonate of the stone, and it becomes a permanent sort of. It attracts anything oil-based. And then you process the other part of the stone, what we call the non-image area, where you didn't draw. likes water. So when you print them, you actually wet the stone and roll ink over the top, and the two repel each other. So you have ink sticking where it's supposed to, where you drew, magically, because you chemically, it's not magic, you chemically processed it to do this. And then you have water sticking in the non-image areas that repel the ink. So it's basically based on the idea that oil and water don't like each other.
Wow. Are you rolling a stone under a heavy roller? The
Yes.
stone in the paper?
So then when you're actually printing these, so I have some of these students, teeny tiny students moving these huge stones around the shop. So we have a lift, we have, and it's very physical. And you have to, when you're done printing, you actually have to grain, we call it, it's a thing called a levigator, where you wet the stone, you put different, it's almost like sandpaper, but grits, and you grind it off.
You
grind the
exfoliate
image
it off?
Yeah, and then you polish it back down so you can draw on it again. So
you can reuse it.
yeah, so these stones have had hundreds of drawings on them.
How thick is this stone when you get it?
It's about, usually when you get them, they're about like maybe
it's like
8 to
6
10
inches.
inches, and then they start to wear down. And
Oh
then
my
if they
gosh.
wear down enough, they'll either crack or you can mount them on a piece of granite.
Okay. Yeah. So I had been picturing like a very thin thing, but you're describing it's like 6 inches thick. So yeah, I can imagine you can polish that down and use that a lot.
Yeah, and it's only just a really tiny amount. You might be taking a 16th of an inch off each time.
So they still all come from Bavaria?
Yes, and indirect, because so there's printmaking, all the processes go in and out of fashion. So there was a time, Clemson's a really good example recently, where they're like, we're going to go all digital. So they get rid of all their stones, and that's how we have so many. And then we're sitting really pretty when suddenly everyone wants to do stone lithography. And here we are with these really nice stones. Yeah.
People are clamoring for these stones.
Yeah, and we have students that just get totally hooked on it. And then we do more contemporary, so we do photo-based versions of all of the processes.
I'm so interested in this very specific. So is there ever going to be a shortage of these stones produced in this one region?
Well, the limestone quarries in Solnhofen, Germany are still producing limestone, and it's actually a really famous fossil place too.
Wow, have you ever gone there?
No.
To see it, like to see the Mecca, right?
I'd love to. Oh my God.
You stand at this quarry and like yell into it.
It'd be really great. So ours come from, and I just bought one for myself that had a high school diploma on it that was probably 80 years old.
Oh my gosh.
So, they used to, because lithography was the way everything was printed. It still is, newspapers and everything, but, not stones.
So you described, so it's a very physical art, the limestone in particular. And the etchings, so those are into, is it copper plates?
Yeah, so they're usually done in copper. And I say usually because intaglio is really a way of printing, like I said, but the most common is etching and engraving, which is similar, just not using acid.
Yeah, and the acid.
So the acid, the way that works, so you have, and lithography is really the only technique that we know exactly when it was invented, because the guy wrote it down and he was trying to do something else, but he was actually trying to do etching. But etching works where you have a metal plate, and then you have if you're doing true etching, which is using chemistry, it has a ground on it, so if you put it in the acid, nothing would happen. But if you break through that ground, the acid can get there and usually you use a sharp tool that you can make lines, and then you get cross-hatching and hatching. When you put it in the acid does the work for you.
You're dipping it into the acid.
Right. In our case, it's ferric chloride, which is really a heavy corrosive salt. So it's much safer than nitric acid, which is how I learned.
And an etching plate, you don't reuse that over and over again, right?
You actually, if it's a dry point where you just draw into it with your muscle, you can sand it down and use it a few times. They used to do that, like when copper had to be like hand hammered and everything. They would press it again and use it.
Oh, there's so many ins and outs to it.
Yeah, you can use it. And then there's other ways. So it's all about things resisting the acids. So there's something called aquatint, which is you put a fine powder that you basically melt on the plate, and between where it's melted, it's making the acid can get. So it makes this even looking tone. So the longer it goes in the acid, the darker it gets. And you can stop out areas you don't want that to be.
Interesting. How do you, so for your own personal work, I saw on your website you have it broken down, you have paintings, you have drawings, and you have printmaking. How do you, say you're beginning a new series, how do you decide that you're going to do etching versus lithography? Is it a question of how big the final image is going to be, or how detailed do you need it to be?
That's a really good question. And I get bored with working in, so I jump around a lot.
Yeah.
But there are images that I have an idea in my head, and it just appears as that needs to be an etching, or that needs to be a woodcut. And it mainly comes because I've done each, so I kind of know what the language is. and I sometimes abandon ship. Like the woodcut that I showed you that I just started proofing, the really detailed one.
Yeah.
I started that as a lithograph because I wanted it to kind of look like a Dutch still life, and I thought, well, more drawing kind of based. And I started it, and I'm like, I'm not into this.
It wasn't working.
But I think it would make a good woodcut because I would change it. I was kind of just going along as I expected, which was boring to me.
Okay.
So this would kind of shift it into a different realm.
What changed about it when it became a woodcut?
It became a lot more. The space flattened out a little bit, and it became a little less fussy. I mean, even though it's a very fussy woodcut, but it became more about the pattern and the repetition of the marks, and I like that better for this image.
Is there more sort of with different? Do you call it different fields of printmaking or different specialties?
I guess you call it different processes.
Different processes.
Yeah.
Are there? Are some of them more conducive to things that are more detailed or doing things in color?
Definitely.
Okay.
I tell my students this all the time. They'll come to me with this really detailed like pen drawing, and they're like, "I'm going to do a woodcut." I'm like, "Oh, it's good. You can do it, but it's not going to look anything like this."
Oh, right.
Where you could do an etching that looks just like a pen, really detailed pen drawing.
Because what is the tool that you use for the etching?
It's an etching needle.
Etching needle, and that can
or
be very.
A scribe. It's called a scribe, but.
That's very old-timey sounding.
Yeah.
A scribe. So that can be very, very fine. So that's
very fine.
What you'd recommend if somebody is a detailed.
Yeah, and I didn't have them to show you because I just took them down, but I used to work like that. Really just busy detail.
With the time, what people think of these like tiny hatch marks, right, where you're just going really crazy.
But etching can also be very painterly. They can go in different directions, but there's always a certain look an etching has. What I like about etching a lot is I work a little differently where I let the etching kind of run out of control and then I rein it back in.
How do you rein it back in?
So I'll put it in the acid too long, and then everything will go too dark, and then you can actually with metal. It's much more forgiving than a lithograph or a relief print.
Okay.
So I'll actually go in with scrapers and burnishers and bring the lights back out. So it's almost like doing an eraser drawing.
So when you're going to do a print, have you done like a very, very specific drawing of it, or are you kind of just doing the drawing on the plate?
Well, this woodcut was very rare. I got really into drawing on the block, and I made too much of a drawing.
Okay.
But I found it fun because I had to interpret those as cut marks. But the longer I make work, and my paintings are the same, I start with really rough thumbnails and a ton of reference. Like I'll have pictures I took, I'll have little sketches I made, and I'll piece them together on the actual work. So I'll put them
collage.
in. Yeah, but so it's more like I'm collaging them in the work by drawing them in, and then I'll move them around and leave the traces of things.
Okay. So
I feel like it fits more what I'm trying to say with the work, where I'm kind of trying to order something that doesn't necessarily want to be ordered, or that chaos order balance.
Yeah.
And having that actually be part of my process, and because I tend to be. I love drawing and I love detail, and I spent a lot of time learning how to draw, and I like that to be part of my work. But then there's also this, when I start a painting and it's really gestural, I love it, but it isn't what I want it ultimately to be, but I want both of those things in there.
You had in the painting section on your website, the first one, I was different from, I really responded to it. The other ones were more finished, but the first thumbnail on your website, it was like just kind of tones of sepia, and it was very gestural, and there were areas that were unfinished and just kind of like gestural lines, and it was very beautiful, and it was different from all the other ones. But it also maybe just the fact that a lot of it was sepia, that feels like it's a etching as well, just that color kind of.
Yeah, and I those etchings, and I showed you some of the when we were walking here, have both of those things. So I have two plates, and one of them is just like wild gesture drawing, and then the other one has little areas.
Really detailed. Yeah, I love that juxtaposition in there.
And you mentioned unfinished. It's the hardest thing for me to do, and it took me so long because I like to fill everything, and just leaving things go.
Yeah. And
it's hard to do, but it's also harder to make a piece that I want it to be unfinished. But I don't want it. There's a point where you don't want it to actually. You don't want someone to look at it and go, "That's not finished."
Right.
But you want areas of no finish or less finish.
You have to make it look like you have to make it look like it was in your control, and you did that on purpose.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But to me, it's hard. When I worked where I filled every square inch, I knew when I was done.
Right.
Usually I was just tired of it, but this is like, I fuss with these forever. And I try different things.
Yeah, like
and I'm
pull
like,
in
yeah,
and
and I erase, I pull things out of it, and I like that process. But sometimes I just have to go, I don't know if this is done, but I'm going to stop.
Do you think over time, do you feel like you're getting better at like not having to go back and forth so much into it, but like earlier in that process, you can be like, this is a good point. It's good.
Yes.
Do they get better over time?
Definitely. I get, but I usually make it harder on myself. I'll switch techniques, or I'll start combining,
Yeah.
And I don't do that as much as some artists do. I really like to be in the separate rooms. Like, I like to be in the litho room and do litho, and I like to be in the etching room and do etchings. I have mixed the two a few times, but I find that, to me, I like to limit that. But then, but I'll switch when I find myself repeating myself or getting. I don't like to be
get
too.
A little bored.
It sounds stupid, but I don't like to get too comfortable with what I'm doing. Like, I never wanted to be someone that could just, here, do a quick pastel drawing that,
Right, like with your eyeshed, you can just whip it
I have
off.
a system. I don't want a system.
Do you find, is there a particular like type of student who comes to start, taking classes in the painting and printmaking department who really responds to printmaking? Like, what do you think is it in people?
Oh, yes. And sometimes they respond to a process. Like, I'll have them in relief class, and they do okay, and then they get into litho, and they're like,
yeah.
Then I see them in intermediate litho. They want to take an independent study. I have 2 or 3 right now that are amazing lithographers. Like, I'm like, you need to go, find a shop and make lithographs. They just, it's more their language than it is my language. I have a certain way I use it, and I fit it into what I'm doing. But they're like lithographers. I mean, they just think that way. And
is it something about their subject matter?
Yeah, and even the way they think in layers. They're a couple students doing big multicolor, kind of painterly, but they're using, even though they're using photo processes, they're making their own transparencies and shooting them, and layering those in some of they're just like, students are always amazing me. Like, just how fast they can, especially at SCAD, 10 weeks, how fast they can learn a whole lot.
It is, and the idea that you're talking about, that in lithography you have to think in layers, that is a really specific kind of mindset. Like, people who are either good at chess and they can look really far ahead or not. Yeah, I can't.
And I have a limited amount that I can do that. My background is.
And you said you responded more to etching, right? That you took.
I like the workability of etching too. Like, you can't. I always tell this to my students, and I tell it to myself because I don't always take my own advice. You tell your students stuff, and then you run into the same situation, and you're like, I need to think about what I would say to myself. But but I like the fact that the more you have to fix an etching plate, the better it gets. Like, if you have to correct something, and usually it likes to be beat up. Where lithograph, you have to listen to what it wants to do. You can't just say, I'm just going to do what I want with a lithograph.
You don't have as much control over it.
Right. I mean, there's certain steps you need to take, or it just looks like a bad lithograph.
Interesting.
Where etching, you can really beat it up, and you could start with the most horrible thing and make it look like something good.
And you can save it.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. Okay.
And relief too, it's hard to rescue if you overcarve something.
If you go too far. Interesting. Well, this is great. We have so much more to talk about. This is a good time. We're going to take a little station break. Again, everyone, this is Tamara Garvey. The show is Arts on the Air, and I'm here with printmaker Curtis Bartone.
You are listening to WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with a global soul.
Trees are one of Chatham County's most treasured natural resources. Beyond their beauty and cultural significance, the impact of trees are far-reaching and compounding, spanning from economic benefits to health improvements to climate change resilience. Trees are woven into every aspect of our lives. Savannah Tree Foundation protects and grows Chatham County's urban forest through tree planting, community engagement, and advocacy. More information is available at savannahtree.org. This portion of WRUU's programming is brought to you by listeners and by Brighter Day Natural Foods. Brighter Day Natural Foods has been serving Savannah's healthy food and supplement needs since 1978. It is located at the corner of Bull Street and Park Avenue. They have online ordering and curbside delivery available, and now a walk-up window for smoothies, juices, and sandwiches from the deli. They are open from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Saturday and 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. on Sunday. More information can be found at brighterdayfoods.com.
What does it mean when we say that WRUU is a community radio station? It doesn't just mean that we invite the community to create programming, and it doesn't just mean that we're a voice for the community. It also means that we're counting on the community to keep us going, and you are the community. Almost all of our modest budget comes from small annual or monthly donations from listeners like you. You get to enjoy our community-focused programming because many others have stepped forward to do their part. Now do your part by joining our community of listener donors. Go to WRUU.org right now and make a one-time or monthly donation. And thank you for supporting Savannah's community radio station, 107.5 FM.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Arts on the Air. This is Tamara Garvey and I'm with printmaker Curtis Bartone. Welcome back. So Curtis does his own work and then he also is a printmaking professor at SCAD. And you touched on this a little bit before, I wanted to get into it more, but you talked about a lot of times in printmaking things go in editions, like you're going to do a run of 10 or 20 or whatever, and you talked about the pricing of that. And I was curious if, the amount of time that goes into doing a print, is it hard to like price it appropriately to feel like you're recouping the time in it? How does that go?
Oh, definitely, yeah. It's a hard thing because there's always that balance. And I've worked with galleries, and I was with a gallery in Chicago, Byron Roach, and closed a few years back. But he used to just joke, because I always ask, it's a fascinating topic to me how you price artwork.
Yeah.
And he's like, I price it for as much as I can get for it. And there's a
he just
limit,
knows
right?
his,
yeah.
He knows his
and
clientele.
he said, sometimes the psychology is if you price it higher, it looks like you value yourself more. So it's a weird thing. But there's sort of a hierarchy in the art world. So sculpture and painting are at the top, right? And then you have drawing, and then you have printmaking, and then you have photography. So it's like, there's only so much you could ask for a print, especially if you're not like super famous. But you do make more of them, so when you sell one, it's not like you're only one.
Yeah.
So there is that.
But you said you don't like doing that. You don't like doing multiples.
I do. Well, no, I do multiples, but right, I don't make big editions, and it's not what interests me about it. It does, like, if I work, I've done print projects with painters that their main goal was their gallery wanted something at a lower price point that they could also, get out more. And I do like that democratic idea about printmaking, the fact that people that aren't wealthy can collect art. Like, I buy prints all the time. But what bothers me about it is it's considered a lower art form because of that. And people, I think artists sometimes hurt each other that way, where you'll have someone go, oh, I can sell these for $15 a piece. And it's like, you can. It's true, but you're screwing it up for everyone else, right? And you're also not making any money. But for me, it takes a lot more time to make the matrix. The matrix is the part you make the print from, like woodblock or whatever. That takes takes me a long time to develop and get it to where I want it. And then to actually, the physical work is a lot.
Yeah, the printing of it.
And then I can knock out a painting in probably a quarter of the time. Like even a larger painting.
Really?
I paint really fast, and I could get so much more for it.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing also that, even if it's a painting, but something on paper people don't value as highly as on canvas or panel, which is interesting. But things on paper, you have to frame them. There's a whole aspect to it, and it has to be behind glass, and people don't always want that in their home. There's that aspect of it, the glass work as well. So when you're doing an edition of printmaking, what is the deal with, like, depending on what number it is it thought that the higher numbers the print has gotten better and better?
It depends on the process, but realistically, most printmakers that are making their own work, they're supposed to all be identical. And so when you see a print, right, you have the bottom number, that's how many of it exist, and the top number, what number in the sequence.
Yeah.
I only know of one printmaker that actually, I keep track sometimes just to know what I've done, but when I round up my edition, like, they're spread out everywhere, I lay them out, I move them around, I decide which ones get rejected, which ones get in. I don't have any idea when I print them anymore.
Interesting. Okay.
But what determines probably, I guess, desirability more is like if there's only 5 in existence, that becomes much
just
more
the size of the
valuable.
edition.
Right.
What is the artist proof?
So an artist proof, if you're working in a shop where you're publishing work, like say you're printing something for Kiki Smith, and the artist proofs are the proofs, it's usually no more than 10% of the edition that the artist gets to keep.
Okay.
And then the shop would sell the rest. Artist printmakers, like myself or my students or Deb, my colleague, artist proofs could be one that's outside of the edition, like when I'm color proofing, so I'll try different colors, but I'm like, I like that color, but it's not going to be my edition.
It's like your
or
experiment.
I printed it on a different. It's an experiment, but it's better than an experiment. It's one that you're like, I really like this. Like I'll exhibit artist proofs. But
do you have any thoughts on the verbiage of like prints versus reproductions when you're talking about,
yes.
you know?
Well, we call them hand prints. So they are where you make the matrix, and that can be done digitally, but the end result is inking and running through a press or squeegeing with a screen print. Very different than like a G-clay print, which you know, most people are pretty accepting of those. I hate the idea. I just hate that. I'm just going to make a nice print of my painting. It's like, well, then make that your finished art. Why do you even have a painting? You know?
Yeah, I wonder. I think for for the average person, maybe who's buying, the idea that there's like printmaking where the actual art is, you know, one of a kind that is a piece, and the use of the word print for a G-clay print just confuses people if they don't really know what you're talking about.
And that's a good. We once had an admissions person come through and say, this is where people from other majors come and make reproductions of their work. And I thought that is exactly what printmaking is.
That's exactly the
not,
opposite, right? Yeah.
So when I make a print, it's not. I mean, I get inspired by my other work. Like I'll make a drawing and I'll be like, oh, I think I want to make a litho like that. But I've never made a print that was from another piece.
Right, exactly.
It's always its own thing, and I'm kind of a purist that way.
That's interesting that person used that term, because it's literally, it's like every reproduction can be, how am I going to say this? Every reproduction can be called a print, but every print can't be called a reproduction, right? Yeah.
And that's why we use handmade prints.
Yeah.
I think that's a term.
Does that help
Yeah.
people? Yeah. Because I would think also for the pricing, like somebody's in a gallery show and they're looking at things on the wall, and there's some drawings and there's some prints and some paintings, and you want to make sure that potential buyers are looking at it and knowing that the thing that you've priced, like, this is a one of a kind, this is you know, a work of art. Yeah. It's not just a thing that came off of like a printer.
Right. And for me, it changes the content of my work. So to me, it's integral. You know, it is that, you know, form and content. How I make it, you know, affects what I'm saying. You know, so it's not just trying to say it with something that's easier to do. You know.
How did you mentioned a minute ago that when you paint, you work really quickly. Why is that it's so different for you?
Oh, I guess I've done it so much longer, and I can take really loose underpaintings and, you know, make them look much tighter than they are too.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm also doing the same things with my paintings now. I'm leaving bigger sections unfinished.
Is it fun to, like, when you're doing painting, that then you're working on canvas and panel, and it's, because in your printmaking it's always paper, so does that get a little tiring and you're excited for like a different substance?
Yeah, but you know, the weird thing is, and it frustrates me to death, my most interesting paintings right now are on paper.
Oh, okay.
And I'm dying. I'm like, finally, being in the house I'm in for 20 years, turned the standing garage into a studio.
Okay.
And it's just a great place to work, and I love it. And I'm like, I can oil paint. Big giant canvas, and I'm oil painting, and then I'm looking at these pieces on paper I'm doing with gouache and acrylic, and I'm like, those are so much better.
You liked better?
So much better. Yeah.
Is this
and
during COVID you came up with your garage studio? Okay.
Yeah. And that was a bad time to be, you know, because everything was way more expensive, all the supplies. It was a crappy garage, so just we had to do so much work. I had a really good person doing it, but you know, it was.
Now you have.
And then. So now I'm carving a lot in my studio.
Oh.
Because I'm really into relief, which COVID really pushed me into.
I was going to ask you how you found balancing being a full-time professor with doing your own.
It's a tough one. It's one of those never-ending struggles.
Yeah.
And it's nice to be in printmaking because I can start things as demos. And I'm not like a lot of the painting teachers do their own work in class. I've never been able to do that because those are two different worlds for me. The thing I actually left teaching for times just because I wasn't getting enough time to do my work. But I really missed it. I love teaching and I love working with. I mean, I find that inspiring ultimately, but I've also adapted to, I used to be a really routine, like I like the 9 to 5, working on your art kind of.
Leaving the house.
It's like having times that I just force myself, even if I'm just like sweeping my floor or something, where I'm in my studio or in my space wherever I work.
Right.
I've adapted, and now I will use SCAD's long breaks really well. Like I don't do holidays anymore. I'm just like, no, it's valuable time. I'll visit people.
There's that nice month-long winter break.
And right, and that huge summer break, because I don't teach in the summer.
Yeah.
I don't see how people do that and don't burn out. But
so that's your time to really delve in.
yeah, and so I'm really good at getting huge bursts of work done, because it's always funny to me, because I'm always struggling with it. And like foundations, a few times is, can you like give they have this thing called talk about teaching. You're really good at balancing the two. Can you talk about that? And I don't think I am. I'm like, no, I'm not getting enough done. I'm not going to do that. But I do get pretty, I can get a big amount of work, and I'm really into residencies too. And before COVID, I was, I'd go somewhere just to make work. And that's one of the nice things about these long breaks and these short quarters.
Do you kind of always have like a series that you're working on, a particular concept that you're trying to like say that when summer is coming up pretty soon, do you already have an idea of a series you're going to do?
Yes,
or
yeah, definitely. And it usually comes from things that I do a lot of research, and right now I'm researching I've always been interested in endangered animals and things like that, but endangered plants and how I've been reading a lot about trees. So those are starting to come into my body of work, and even how migration works and how it's being interfered with by agriculture and all that.
Yeah.
And that's the woodcut that you saw, the expanse of cornfield, and that whole idea of these things all being part of our world, but still these animals having to cross these things. And I look at it metaphorically some, but I am actually just interested in animals too.
Yeah.
Like I'm not using them, like a lot of people use animals as like stand-in.
As a metaphor.
Or something, but there's personal things in my work, definitely, and things that I don't, like I'm not, even though I'm an environmentalist, I'm not preachy about it. I don't want to make work about that, but my awareness of it comes in
it's like an observation.
Yeah, but it's not saying this is bad, because I love drawing architecture and buildings and factories. So I'm not going, this icky factory I'm gonna put back here. It's like I love the form, and
Yeah. It's just sort of observing and marking the changes.
Yeah, and seeing these things, but not only just what you see, like when I look out this window, but what I see in my mind. And I wish I could remember quotes better, because an artist said something really interesting about an inner landscape, and I always think about that, how you internalize and filter.
Yeah, there was that interesting period, like during COVID at the beginning, when people were home, where we were getting all these reports of, everything, like bodies of water were rejuvenating, and the pollution was dying. Like there weren't cars on the road, and so LA, you could you'd actually see the sky further, and then in the water, like around Italy, that there weren't cruise ships anymore, and so all the flora and fauna were coming back, and there was like a period where it's like we reversed things a little bit, and then it just kind of roars back to life, right? The machinery of humans comes back to life, and people go back to work, and but yeah, they had like a little blip where it was like the animals and the plants came back a bit, right? They got to roam more.
Right, I forgot all about that.
Yeah.
That was fascinating to me when I'm just. Because everyone's like, oh, we don't really have that much effect on anything, and you see that little.
Oh my God! Yeah, it was like 2 months, quote unquote, of like staying home.
And then you realize how easy it would be.
Right, if we really did
reverse some of this stuff.
Yeah.
So.
You mentioned residencies. I know in the past on your CV you had a residency in Iceland that you went to.
Yes.
What was a really crazy thing that you noticed about the landscape there?
Oh wow, it's so strange and varied. But parts of it look like the surface of the moon.
Right.
And then there's these like, when the Vikings were there, or the Nordic people. They cut down all the trees, so all the forests now that are growing back are really stunted, and it's such a brutal environment. So they have these like mini forests, and then they have, of course, the sea is really interesting there, and there's islands, a lot of volcanic activity, like everything's bubbling, and
steam,
steam everywhere, and there's rivers that there's underground things coming in, so you can bathe in them when it's really cold.
It's like the healing waters, right?
I've only been there in the summer.
Okay.
So I was there. I did a residency in Akerberry, which is like the middle, but up north. And it was June, and I never saw it get dark the whole entire time. That was very strange.
Yeah, yeah.
And I like to nap, so it was like constant napping.
Did you have
so
to
take 4 hour
black
naps.
out your windows somehow at night?
Yeah, I eventually had to do that.
Did you do a series of work about the landscape there when you were there? Or?
You know, it's weird. I'm not a plein air painter at all. So I love to work in my studio. So I was doing sketches, and I have a hard time just drawing or painting a landscape. I have if I don't have something to say about it, I'm not that interested in it. I mean, I like the technical part of drawing, but I would go out and make studies of things and then start to process those in the place I was staying.
Yeah.
But when I travel, I take a lot of pictures and I observe a lot, but I'll sit down and make a quick sketch. But I did want to go there specifically for that kind of environment. But what I found is it doesn't affect me the way I think it's going to ever. And this happens every residency. I don't know what's going to end up happening. I have a plan, and it never works out that way. And the environment affects me in a weird way. I went to a place in Venice. It was on Murano, which is where the glass island. And I wanted, because they could make really big. I was working really large and making etchings, and they had facilities to do that. And the environment affected me more, the chaos of it, and the fact that the studio, I was a little bit stressed because the studio didn't have a lot of things, and I had to go find them. And the mood of the place affected me more than there's some little things that pop into the work from there, but it's almost like I'm doing things I could do anywhere. But the actual way the piece came out was affected by the environment.
Okay, so it wasn't literal things that you were seeing in Venice.
It's more getting too touchy-feely sounding, but it is more the vibe that affects how I work. And the fact of feeling out of place it inspires me. It gives me energy.
It puts you on the back foot a bit.
Yeah, and it's probably why I switch techniques all the time, because I want to be a little uncomfortable, and I want to feel like things are new. I think that affects me a lot.
So this was a particular center in Venice that you went to because they specialized in being able to do these really large etching plates?
Yeah, and it was a really big space. I had such a great time there.
Is that place still in existence that people could go to?
No, it's Venice Printmaking Studio, but there's another Scuola Grafica there that is a really good place too, and I'd love to go there.
Do you have recommendations for students studying printmaking of what are some amazing places that they could go visit to see these old school techniques?
Well, they're more like residencies, but of course there's a bunch of lithography studios in Paris.
Yeah.
In fact, a former Deborah Cheney is her name, and she used to actually be a long time ago a shop tech, like Lexi, who you met. And she studied at Tamarind and went there and started this really amazing atelier. But they have a long history of lithography.
Is this the thing in New Mexico, you said?
Yeah, so Tamarind is in New Mexico. There's a place called Crown Point for etching in San Francisco.
Oh, okay, cool.
That would be a mecca for an etcher.
So there's just a few random places around the U.S. basically that are really specialized in
and they're more just known for, if you're an artist and you want someone to make etchings for you, and you're going to do the plates, but they're going to do all the master printing work, like Crown Point in San Francisco. And for Tamarind, if you were an artist and you wanted a litho done, you would go there. And they train a lot of lithographers.
Have you done any residencies in the Southwest in general?
I've never. It's one of the few places in the country I've never really spent any time.
Okay.
So I'd love to. I would love to.
I think this would be super interesting because earlier you were talking about, when you talked about the natural world and that we just have this vision of it in our head and it's not necessarily what it actually is that I have a couple of friends in Phoenix and I've gone to visit them a few times. And when we would always leave Phoenix and take a road trip out into the countryside, and the hills, there's no grass and there's not trees like here. It's very weird feeling coming from the East Coast. And the hills are just dotted with cacti. But in my mind, I always imagined cactuses that they looked like in cartoons when you're a kid, where it's a three-armed cactus and the middle one is longer and then the two on the side are shorter. You just picture them. Cactuses don't look like that. There was literally no cacti that looked like that. They all are weird and misshapen and lumpy and crazy, and they grow in weird directions. And none of them look like this perfect three-armed cactus that I had in my head. I thought that was so weird.
Yeah, I would love to visit that.
Yeah, you have to go see it.
But I am interested. I always go on these phases. I was, reading, books like Cadillac Desert and, just about water. And LA is one of my favorite cities. And just the fact that they don't really have any water. They're like taking it from everywhere else, and Phoenix.
Interesting,
for
yeah.
example, and just those kinds of things.
It's funny that I forget that LA is like technically a desert.
Yeah.
I don't really think of a big city as being a desert, so that is, yeah, interesting. Can you talk a little bit about, so now you've been teaching since, how many years have you been a professor?
I've been teaching SCAD for 20 years.
Okay, yeah. It said you moved to Savannah in 2001, is that right? To teach. So
is that longer than 20 years then?
that's a little over 20 years.
And I took some years off.
Okay.
So I don't know, but I still count.
So it's a lot of teaching under your belt. Can you talk a little bit about how you have all these years of like breaking down processes and explaining it to people? How has that kind of changed your work over time? Or are there things that you've like figured out? There's shortcuts or things you figured out or things that have changed?
This is a weird thing. My students figure out shortcuts.
Okay.
And they do it often so I get taught certain ways and I get these habits, and like, for example, when you process a litho stone, you're supposed to let it sit at least overnight for the first time you process it.
Okay.
And my students, they either don't pay attention or whatever, or they're in a hurry.
Yeah.
I'm finding out that isn't true. You can try it and see if it's going to work much sooner than that. So I'll often be adjusting my way of teaching based on what my students are doing, and it's almost like I have this giant experiment going on. So 10 people will do things wrong, 9 of them will be wrong and mess up their work, but one of them will find like a new way of doing it.
Yeah.
Oh, that worked really well. And, but yeah, I'm also, what's great about teaching printmaking compared to anything else, and I actually now, it's a horrible thing to say, I get bored teaching painting now. Because there's not unexpected
There's not enough
things.
technicalities to it?
Yeah, printmaking is constant. I feel like it's a lot like being a doctor. You have to ask someone so many questions and pinpoint what went wrong. So it's constant problem solving, but also there's students that are like, so if I did this, do you think it would work? And I'm like, let's go do it.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
we'll find out. So it's so much fun because you're constantly, like I learn so many new things every quarter. And so I seem really smart, like I know all this stuff. It's because I've seen, if I was working by myself, I wouldn't learn as much.
You're seeing the result of so many other experiments.
Right. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not,
Yeah,
but it's so exciting, and it sort of made me. There was a time when I came back to teaching after I'd taken some time off. I wanted to see, like, I'm going to go back to it and see if I still even like it. And then I was teaching in foundations, and then the printmaking person at the time saw me working in there. It's like, oh, can you teach some print classes? And I thought, I don't really teach printmaking very much, but I do it. So I started teaching it, and then I'm like, oh my God, this is exactly what I want to teach.
Yeah.
So,
well, lucky that person just happened to come across you, right?
I was very fortunate.
Have you ever had any, so you're working with sharp things and copper plates and heavy stones and acid. Have you ever had any injuries or accidents?
They're all minor. The scariest injuries I've had nothing to do with the print shop. There's students that aren't sleeping or they're not eating all day and they pass out. And that's really it.
Yeah.
That happens in painting classes too. And
like the morning that there's a critique.
Oddly, that's the scariest part.
That is, okay.
But yeah, I get, people, smashing their fingers with stones. But I haven't had anything really serious.
Hasn't had any acid situation?
No, I have had one acid situation, but not a burn. Someone dropped one of the vials of nitric acid, so we pour soda ash on it, get everybody out, and the shop tech comes with sort of a hazmat-looking suit.
Interesting.
And bundles it up, but.
Do you have any sort of words of wisdom for people getting into teaching? Anything you wish maybe you'd been told that would have helped at the beginning?
I know this sounds strange, but I used to always get really upset when people went into teaching because they thought, well, it's a really good way to earn a living if you're going to be an artist.
Right.
I think that's changing a lot. I think SCAD has some really good teachers, and it changed from when I went to school where, like Northwestern, these people were hired because they were famous painters and they wanted their name attached to the university.
And they're not necessarily a good teacher, right?
So it sounds silly, but go into teaching because you like it.
Yeah.
You like what you do, and you want to show other people.
Ticking.
And you're just gonna make people waste their money if you're a bad teacher.
It's true. You could make the argument that it's very, very selfish to kind of like hamstring your future students that way if you're not that into it.
Right, and I think that would be the main advice.
Do you have any? So we're kind of coming close to the end of it. Do you have any? Just talking about Savannah specifically, some things that you'd like to see happen in the art scene in the next few years around here?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see it grow, and I think the problem is how does that happen?
Yeah, what does that mean?
What I am
grow?
seeing though, well, I'd like to see more galleries. I'd like to see more nonprofit places where I think there's too many pay-to-show galleries.
Okay.
And I think that and that's something that's happening more. I mean, when I was pretty lucky when I graduated from grad school in the 90s. There was a lot of spaces that you would apply, and they would help a lot.
Yeah,
and there's still some of those, but they're out of Savannah. I want to see those in Savannah, and I think there's a potential there that just takes the right group.
You
want to
see more curated
there's
shows.
Places, there's cool places like Sulphur, and and even just as far as the Jeps in Telfair is doing better at they have their
that Art 912 room.
And that has helped me, so that's good to see happening. But there just needs to be, I think we have to get past like a critical mass where it's going to then suddenly take off.
Yeah,
it just seems to be pushing
where
to
there's
that
just
point.
so much more
and
demand for it.
And Savannah's growing, and I moved here from Chicago. I'm like, I'll give it 5 years, then we're going to move on. And it grew on me, and now it's, I wanted to leave, or not wanted to leave, but I'm thinking I'm not going to end up here, and I was always looking at where I wanted to live next.
Yeah.
And then suddenly I'm
now
like,
it's
I really
22
like
years.
It here. I like it here,
Yeah.
And it's growing nicely, I think.
Well, I think it's interesting. So, I think there's two like community clay places in town, because that's this other field where you need a lot of equipment, and so it really works to have like a centralized place where people pay in and can share it. And like, why is it's so hard to have like a community printmaking place?
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's what I should have talked about the most. That's the most thing that I would like to see. And I was, there was a time when I was like dead set on helping that happen, and I don't know what got me away from it, but a place for people to print after they get out of school would be really great. And almost every city has that.
Oh,
and
really?
Savannah's one of the few that doesn't. I don't think Charleston does either. And there's, I know there's printmakers that have their own little press and stuff, but
like a centralized place where people can pool, where it'll be better equipment if everybody's paying into it.
And when I was in Chicago, I printed at 3 different places, not at the same time, but there was a printmakers collaborative where you could go and pay if you had a project you wanted to print, and other printmakers to be around.
Well, maybe that's something you could work toward in the future.
Yeah, I would love to see that happen.
On your website, it looked like you have a show coming up at the end of the year in Carrollton, Georgia. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And speaking of art centers that I'd like to see here, that's one of them. So I have that in October. The opening is, I think, in the end of October, beginning of November.
Okay.
We're still kind of working out dates for that. And then I'm going to do a ceramics printmaking workshop, because they have ceramicists there.
Oh, anything else that you want to, any final parting words to leave us with?
I do think about, when people, the best advice I got, which sounds, again, really ridiculously simple. I had a teacher say, no matter what happens to you, keep making work. And it sounds easy, but when nobody's paying attention and you feel like I just got rejected from 5 things in a row.
Right.
Why am I doing this?
Or you're exhausted from your day job.
Yeah, it's hard to keep yourself going, but it is very important.
It's hard to start up again if you stop for a while.
Right. That's exactly true. And
I
the longer I live, the more I see the wisdom in that. It just seemed like such simple advice. I'm like, that's all you have?
That's great.
Yeah. And that would be what I tell my students too.
Thank you very much, Curtis. This has been lovely. Fascinating.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
You.
All right, everyone. This has been Curtis Bartone. And of course, I will post links to your Instagram and your website in our liner notes so everyone can see his beautiful work. Thank you. Next up on WRUU, That Old Savannah Magic from 4 to 6 p.m. It's a variety show featuring Savannah history, radio theater, interviews, and music.
You are listening to WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with a global soul.